name is Rikkisha Gilmore-Byrd, and I'm going to be talking to you today about infusing cultural inclusion into any curriculum. I want to tell you about a social experiment. This social experiment has been done many times before, but this is one of the most recent published examples. Imagine you are in a waiting room full of people sitting and waiting to be called. All of a sudden, a beep sounds. Everyone stands up until the beep stops and then sits back down, except one person that has no idea what's going on. This continues for about 10 minutes with a beeping sound periodically every 30 seconds or so. Within the first few minutes, the one person that was not standing before begins to stand every time the beep sounds and then sits. However, they have no idea why they're doing this, but they continue to do so. Little by little, those in the waiting room are called back, leaving only the person that was not aware of why people were standing. When the next beep sounds, do you believe the person remains sitting since they had no idea why they were standing and no one was watching them? Nope. They stood at each beep, although no one else was there or was even watching them do what they were doing, besides the hidden camera that they had no idea was there. While it was surprising within itself that they continued this without knowledge why, what was more surprising is that when another person came in and sat down, she began to model this behavior, and when the beep sounded, she stood up. That person looked at her and asked, "Why are you doing that?" Her response was, "I don't know, but everyone else was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to." So what do you think happened when the next beep sounded? Both her and the new person stood when the beep sounded. This continued for many more people that came into the waiting room, and everyone eventually began to stand when the beep sounded. Some questioned and others did not, but everyone stood at the beep. Just that quickly, it became the social norm, and everyone began to conform. Even after she was gone, those in the waiting room were standing, and they had no idea why, just like she had. We may not even realize when we are being sheep. And I can admit, I'm guilty of following a social norm without knowing why, and I believe that I have expertise in culture, diversity, and inclusion. You may not believe you would ever be a sheep, and you would always be the one to ask questions and make your own choices before adopting a belief or an action. This is great. Model and support our students to do the same thing and create social norms that are inclusive of all diversity. Encourage them to ask questions and to not just decide they're going to do what's easy because they see everybody else doing it. Help us to produce students that are more culturally inclusive. Culture is not race. A lot of people believe that that's exactly what it is, or age, or ethnicity, or sexual orientation, or religion. Race and culture refers to people, groups, and their classifications, although both words are very different in how they classify people. To start with the concept of race and culture, it's important to know what each of them mean. Race is a classification of people according to their physical appearances, geographic ancestry, and heritable characteristics. Culture is a classification of people according to their beliefs and values. That includes spirituality, religion, region, language, and their livelihoods. Race and culture are both classifications of people, as we've identified. Race is a label given to people based on their physical characteristics and their skin tone, while culture is a shared belief and values, such as the notion of good versus bad and right versus wrong. And I like to say that culture is a totality of all learned behaviors. Race is based on the physical appearance, while culture is based on beliefs, values, and life symbols. So what that says is people with the same race can have different culture, while people with the same culture can have different races. Really interesting. Like I said, Culture, in my definition, is a totality of all learned behaviors. So it's all of these things. Cultural awareness is the foundation of communication, and it involves the ability of standing back from ourselves and becoming aware of our cultural values, beliefs, and perceptions. When we look at culture and cultural competence as a continuum, most of our students enter college at all different stages of this model, but many of them are not culturally competent. Basically, cultural awareness is a self-awareness and it's very me, them centered. Cultural knowledge is when someone begins to inquire and wonder about other cultures or beliefs. While they may passively wonder about other cultures, they are only knowledgeable about their own. Cultural sensitivity is when someone is open to accept the differences of others, but still not inclusive or completely comfortable being immersed with others. Most students and people in general are somewhere within the middle two circles. Cultural competence is achieved when we are not only accepting of cultures of others, but embracing and comfortable with the differences and equipped to meet the diverse needs of others. Wouldn't it be great if our classes in college were infused with this in every class and interaction, creating not only a diversely inviting, but a diversely embracing environment? We may find that when the buzzer beeps, we are just doing what we've been taught to do. We are just teaching the curriculum that has already been developed. Instead of branching out, asking questions, and learning about ways we can make all people feel more included. When we mix the red and the blues, you get to purple. Still a lighter purple because we can go beyond basic cultural competence and get to an advanced level of cultural competence, or another idea that I'd like to present to you. But the idea that people must be aware of cultural differences and that no one culture is superior to any other culture is what we want to make sure that we are instilling in our students. So I ask you, is cultural competence enough? Cultural competence is an awareness of one's own cultural worldview, attitude towards cultural differences, a knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, and cross-cultural skills. It's an ability to interact effectively with people of different cultures and socioeconomic backgrounds, particularly in the context of many of our fields that we teach. In many of the fields that we teach, you will have to work with people from all different cultures and ethnic backgrounds. So it's important to feel comfortable working with all different types of people. So I ask you, what is the problem with cultural competence? When I think about the variety of people and cultures that I've encountered in my work and personal life, I'm overwhelmed at the prospect of learning the cultural values, norms, practices, and mores of each of these unique cultures. Particularly if I encounter only one individual or family from a particular cultural experience and for a limited time period. Is it really even possible to know everything? How do I know when I'm competent enough? Does my learning stop then because I know everything? Does that apply to everybody that fits within that culture? Let's suppose that I do develop a strong degree of competence in understanding and relating to people from a particular culture. Now I can approach people from the culture with skill and competence. Or can I? There's an inherent risk in assuming that I know everything I need to know to relate effectively across all cultural lines. My knowledge could translate into assumptions about the individual based on a single culture alone. But each individual will have unique experiences of their broader culture and unique subcultures which they are a part. So, family, faith, economic, education, employment, everything, they're all part of these different subcultures. My belief that I'm competent in a certain culture could impede on my sensitivity to the individual experience and how they express their culture individually. When we look at the word competency, it implies that I have collected all knowledge, mastered all skills, and it produces a particular outcome that can be evaluated. It's impossible to master every culture, and this usually leads to stereotyping. So I'd like to introduce you to the concept of humility. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. And this next one says, be like the bamboo. The higher you grow, the deeper you bow. Pride makes us artificial. Humility makes us real. So I want to introduce you to the concept of cultural humility. It moves beyond cultural competence. Cultural competence is a process, not an end product. So if we say that we're culturally competent, that implies that there's an end product. Dr. Melanie Turvalon and Jan Murray Garcia describe cultural humility as a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique. This concept was born out of the medical community as they sought to train medical professionals to provide care to people of all cultural backgrounds. The approach of cultural humility goes beyond the concept of cultural competence to encourage individuals to identify their own biases and to acknowledge that those biases must be recognized. Cultural competency implies that one function with a thorough knowledge of the mores and beliefs of another culture. Cultural humility acknowledges that it's impossible to be adequately knowledgeable about cultures other than one's own. Humility has a traditional connotation of being kind, of kind of meek and humble. But it can also be used to denote a willingness to accurately assess oneself and one's limitations, and the ability to be open to new ideas, contradictory information, and advice. Why is cultural humility important? It means not pigeonholing people. Knowledge of different cultures and their assumptions and their practices is indeed important, but it can only go so far. Cultural humility also is an important step in helping to redress the imbalances of power and acknowledging that that power is there. And it approaches each encounter with the knowledge that one's own perception is full of assumptions and prejudices that can help one to keep an open mind and remains respectful of the other person that's seeking involvement. So I'd like to challenge your understanding of cultural competence and start to kind of move towards cultural humility, which is enhancing our effectiveness while engaging the communities and the students that we serve. According to psychologists, cultural humility includes being respectful, considerate, interested in learning more, open-minded, and a lack of cultural humility is going to be making assumptions about others, being a know-it-all, acting superior, thinking one's understanding more than one actually does. And research indicates that cultural humility improves relationships with others. For me, the gift of cultural humility is that I no longer carry the burden of feeling that I have to know everything about every culture, which I believe is pretty much impossible. Fear about not knowing enough doesn't need to impact my confidence and approach to someone from another culture. Cultural humility also invites me to check my assumptions before I'm dealing with somebody. Rather, I can approach each relationship as a learner, open in my own mind and spirit, and inviting that person to teach me. Becoming a learner in helping people might even level the power imbalance a little bit. Imagine that. I, the instructor, also am looking to the student to empower me about something that they're an expert upon. I can see the individual and the setting aside assumptions about their culture in order to encounter a very unique experience with that person. There are three facets to cultural humility. It's a lifelong commitment to self-reflection and evaluation and self-critique. We'll never arrive at a finish line with cultural humility. And then there's a desire to fix power imbalances. And there's an aspiration to develop mutually respective partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. When we look at the cultural humility humble model, it shows us how to be humble. Humble about the assumptions we make, understanding our own background and culture and how that affects and influences our decisions and beliefs. motivating ourselves to learn more about the other person's background, beginning to incorporate this knowledge into our work. Remember, it's lifelong learning, and emphasizes respect and negotiate service plans as we work with others. So instead of being a know-it-all, ask. With the cultural competence model, we make assumptions that since we've spent time learning about the culture, that we can impose those thoughts and beliefs on anyone that that we believe to belong to that culture. But be humble and ask. You cannot know everything about every cultural component. Culture does not determine behavior. It provides that framework through which someone understands themselves, their environment, and their experiences. It's ever changing, and it's not possible to predict the beliefs and behaviors of someone based on their race, ethnicity, or national origin. It starts with you. Culturally competent teaching and learning facilitates critical reflection. A critical analysis of our own assumptions is a foundation to culturally responsive teaching and learning. Critical reflection on tightly held cultural assumptions is necessary to dislodge misconceptions and stereotypes. So the best way to practice cultural humility, especially in our classroom, is to have skilled dialogue, which is authentic communication without defensiveness, non-judgmental, which is seeking to learn and understand versus pushing an agenda, not a discussion or a debate, allowing us to have that genuine and open dialogue. Self-reflection and critique. Remember that we want to identify how we feel and what our cultural beliefs and norms are so that we can make sure we're not imposing that on others. Transformational conflict, which has us engage in some difficult conversations, gives us some real-time feedback about what we might be imposing on others, and lets us have an opportunity to do some observational learning as we're watching and seeing what happens. There's also some negotiation in there because we're analyzing power and the fact that sometimes as instructors, often as instructors, there's a power imbalance that might be perceived by the student. And then inquiry allows us to ask these powerful questions and have some coaching conversations. So now I'm going to present some strategies to implement into your classroom. Number one, prepare. We have a noble purpose as we are serving students to make the students feel included so that they are open to learning and sharing. This can be best accomplished by creating an environment that feels inclusive, which we can call a safe space. I know you're probably asking how you can achieve that in the little amount of time that you spend with a student, and what the heck is a safe space? This can be achieved by first taking inventory of the environment. If you're in a campus classroom, does the environment seem inviting? Are there pictures, literature, and materials that are inclusive of many different types of people? Does the structure of the room create openness, or is it more likely that people would kind of segregate when they came into the classroom? In the online class, do your announcements, articles that you share, and stories that you share create an inclusive feel of various cultures? As you develop your roadmap, be proactive about the approach that you will foster openness and communication in many diverse ways and create a safe space. Safe spaces are a buzzword in higher education right now. They are traditionally places where people can be around like-minded people and feel comfortable letting their hair down and being themselves. Some do not believe that this fosters inclusiveness and instead promotes segregation and groupthink. Discuss strategies and share ideas in your team meetings and faculty meetings. I challenge you to bend your mind to think about how you can create that in the classroom and in the college so that people feel as though they are welcome and accepted despite some of the intolerances they may experience in the outside world. Which leads me to the next one, provoke. Provocation typically has a negative connotation, but it can create positive results. We are often taught not to provoke people, but provocation in the classroom can provide growth. We have all heard the term, do not wake the sleeping bear. With so much violence and misunderstandings going on in the world, they're often directly related to dislike and hate of certain types of people and cultures. We may be afraid to provoke by discussing controversial topics or by pushing students out of their comfort zones. When provocation is supported, it can produce very positive results. So when you start to provoke, you want to make sure you set your ground rules. You have to develop those ground rules before beginning to provoke your students to leave their comfort zone. These should at least include the expectation that everyone will be respectful and open to hear someone else's point of view, regardless of whether they agree. It is imperative to begin the course with explanation of these ground rules. They can be included in a written announcement and verbally. You will have to make sure you continue to keep the pulse in your class through your active engagement. Students need to be challenged by different perspectives while being supported at the same time to inquire and discuss their opinions in comparison of others. If we are not challenging students, then we are not exceeding expectations as educators. This can be achieved in many ways, but I'll offer you a few and welcome your discussion on others. In a discussion, whether live or in a written form, play devil's advocate and present the other side of a student's point of view. Challenge them to support their opinions with research and examples, and push them to think creatively and critically on how another person may believe the opposite and why. Create a debate on hot topics. There's a lot of them right now. Debates can help people understand the value of hearing different opinions in a controlled environment. Don't allow the student to pick a side in which they will debate on a controversial topic. Randomly give them a side to debate and discuss. Whether in a class or a written discussion post, it will force them to learn another viewpoint. This can get really fired up, but it allows the class to discuss things in a controlled environment with you as the support. Use current events in the media. Take a current event topic that is going on and encourage and promote how this topic can be related to your field from a diverse standpoint. What are some good examples of things currently going on that should be analyzed by different viewpoints? One could be kneeling during the national anthem, not allowing entrance into the United States from other countries, sexual reassignment surgery not being covered by insurance. Why is it important to deal with issues of social justice in higher education? That's something to think about. Encourage storytelling. Encourage students to tell stories about how they have handled or seen something handled in the real world as it relates to the curriculum that you're presenting. This will allow them to discuss their cultural beliefs on a topic and why they feel that way. This begins with you telling your own stories. Be a brave yet humble example. Use several senses to engage. Research of adult education learning principles has shown that we retain 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we see and hear, 70% of what we say, and 90% of what we do and say. So figure out ways to have students talk about and do things that promote cultural competence in the classroom so that they will take it with them into their communities and push them forward again to cultural humility. When you provoke something, you have to be prepared for it to attack. What often happens when you back something or someone up into a corner? Think about a cat. We have to follow up our provocation with positivity. We do not want to provoke students by pushing them to discuss or share things outside of their comfort zone without some support. Our goal is to teach that you have to be sensitive and aware of other people and their beliefs and how their own actions can affect others. If we do not discuss controversial topics in a controlled environment, how will we know how to recognize and handle them when we're confronted with them in our career? If you discuss something controversial or push someone to review a different viewpoint, make sure you follow up and explain why you push them out of their comfort zone. Monitor the ways that students are responding to each other regarding controversial topics and intervene when necessary, but also give them a little room to work it out amongst each other. You may have to remind them about those ground rules and respect at certain points. While debate can be a useful strategy to encourage critical thinking on a topic, there is also a time to listen and acknowledge someone else's pain or experience, especially when they're storytelling. Remind students that they do not have to agree or disagree with someone's story or their experience. That's that person's story or experience. It's just as important to raise awareness through exposure without having a discussion about it. That can be accomplished by sharing the stories of others or encouraging students to share their stories with support, of course. That leads me to produce. The goal is to produce more culturally competent students and promote cultural humility. If you want to discuss strategies or ways to individually incorporate this into your class or your campus, use your resources as we cultivate the support of inclusive environments and for our students. Remember that there is always an opportunity for you to infuse that cultural inclusion into your curriculum. Assess your own teaching, your delivery style, the power. Remember, you always want to present students with a strengths-based approach. They're the expert on themselves, so allow them to be the experts. Delivery must acknowledge and address a diversity of learning styles while challenging dynamics of power and privilege in your classroom. Vary your instructional techniques. Use some lecture, some cooperative learning, some dialogue, some individual work, and maybe some student teaching, allowing that student to be the expert on something. Understand the dynamics of power in the room so that you do not perpetuate privilege and oppression. Recognize who you call on, who you respond to in the discussion. Who do you encourage to work through a problem, and who do you give the answer to or provide more resources or strategies? Challenge the notion of teaching as mastery. Ask students what they already know about a topic so that you know where you can build upon. Ask students what they want to learn about a topic, and ask students to participate in the teaching of a topic. These are just some strategies that I'm offering to you to infuse some cultural inclusion into your classroom. If you have additional feedback or questions for me, I'd love to talk about this further with you from an academic perspective. Thanks for listening.